Captain Ethan Delaney stood at the helm of the Horizon, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of the holographic display in front of him. The hum of the starship's engines was a steady reminder of the mission that loomed ahead. This wasn't just any mission, it was the culmination of months of delicate negotiations between humanity and the Relin, a mysterious alien race known for their unique emotional and physical intensity. The success of this alliance was critical, not just for Earth, but for the entire sector. The Relin held advanced technologies that could shift the balance of power in a galaxy that teetered on the edge of conflict. Lieutenant Kara Mayfield, Delaney's trusted second-in-command, stood beside him, her gaze focused on the same holographic readout. "They'll be arriving any moment now," she said, her voice low but steady. "Are you ready for this?" Delaney nodded, though there was an edge of tension in his muscles that hadn't been there before. "We have to be," he replied, more to himself than to Kara. His deep blue eyes flickered over the reports one last time. The Relin were different, more intense in every way. Physically imposing, emotionally raw, and with customs that often clashed with human norms. He knew they were unpredictable, and he had prepared himself for the challenges they presented. But no amount of preparation could ease the strange knot forming in his stomach as the clock ticked closer to their arrival. "Captain," one of the bridge crew announced, "the Relin delegation has arrived in our docking bay." Delaney took a deep breath and turned to Kara. Time to make history. They moved in unison through the wide corridors of the Horizon, the starship's pristine walls gleaming under the soft lights. When they arrived at the conference chamber, Delaney paused before the doors, feeling the gravity of the moment. This would be the first time humans had met the Relin face-to-face after months of virtual negotiations. So much rested on this, an alliance that could save humanity from the encroaching threat of the Nomar, a hostile alien race that had been steadily expanding their territory. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing the large, imposing figures of the Relin delegation. At the center stood Ambassador Lyra, the leader of the Relin group. Her golden skin shimmered under the lights, and her eyes, an intense, molten amber, immediately locked onto Delaney's. A flicker of something unreadable passed between them, a charge of energy that made Delaney's heart beat just a little faster. "Captain Delaney," she greeted him, her voice smooth and rich, yet carrying a weight that made him feel exposed, as though she could see straight through his diplomatic facade. Ambassador Lyra, Delaney replied, stepping forward and extending his hand in the traditional human greeting. Lyra's gaze shifted from his face to his outstretched hand, and for a moment she did nothing. Delaney felt the room's atmosphere shift, a strange stillness settling over them as if time itself had slowed. Then, with a fluid motion, she took his hand, but instead of shaking it, she leaned closer, her gaze piercing, and whispered in a tone that sent shivers down his spine, "Wait, you have it 9 inches? Let me try it." Delaney froze. For a split second, he wasn't sure if he'd heard her correctly. The words seemed surreal, out of place. There was a subtle shift in the room, and even the other Relin delegates appeared momentarily confused, their eyes flicking toward their leader. Kara, standing behind Delaney, stiffened, her face a mask of confusion and alarm. Lyra, however, didn't falter. Her gaze remained steady, unblinking, as if the words she'd spoken were completely normal. She continued, her voice steady but still carrying that unnerving edge, "Your strength. You are known among your kind for exceptional physical prowess, are you not?" Delaney blinked, his mind racing to catch up. He quickly schooled his features into a neutral expression, not wanting to let on how off balance her comment had left him. "Ah, yes," he replied, his voice calm despite the disarray in his thoughts. "Humans have been known for certain attributes." Lyra's lips curled into a faint smile, but her eyes remained intense, studying him like a predator would its prey. "We are curious about you," she said, her fingers still lingering lightly on his hand. "Your people have shown great resilience," but also she trailed off, her eyes sweeping down and back up, "great physical potential." There was no mistaking her meaning now. The tension in the room grew palpable, and Delaney, ever the professional, felt a surge of discomfort. The line between diplomacy and something far more personal had been crossed. He subtly pulled his hand away, clearing his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on the negotiations at hand, Ambassador." Lyra raised a brow, her smile widening slightly, as if amused by his attempt to regain control. "Of course, Captain," she purred. "But do not misunderstand me. I find your people fascinating. I am always eager to understand more about what makes you unique." Delaney nodded stiffly. "I'm sure there will be ample time for mutual understanding throughout the course of these talks." Kara stepped forward, her voice steady but carrying a firm edge. "Captain, perhaps we should begin with a review of our shared interests. The threat from the Nomar grows by the day, and if we are to stand any chance against them, we need to focus on the specifics of the alliance. Delaney silently thanked Kara for the timely intervention. Agreed, let's get started. As the negotiations began, Delaney tried to focus on the task at hand, but Lyra's earlier words lingered in the back of his mind. Her eyes, when they met his, seemed to burn with a strange intensity that made it hard to concentrate. She was direct, almost aggressively so, and yet there was something undeniably magnetic about her presence. She radiated power, and every subtle gesture, every glance, seemed to carry an unspoken promise of something more. The talks proceeded smoothly, at least on the surface. Both sides discussed the logistics of a shared defense force, the exchange of technology, and strategic military support. But beneath the surface, Delaney could feel the undercurrents of tension that had nothing to do with politics or war. Every time Lyra spoke, her words seemed to carry a double meaning, laced with suggestion, and Delaney couldn't help but feel like he was being tested in ways that went beyond diplomacy. During a brief recess, Delaney stepped out into the corridor to catch his breath. He leaned against the cool metal wall, closing his eyes for a moment to center himself. He had faced countless challenges in his career, from life-or-death battles to intricate political maneuvering, but this was something entirely different. How did one deal with an alien ambassador who seemed intent on making every interaction a blend of professional diplomacy and provocative suggestion? The sound of soft footsteps made him open his eyes. Lyra stood at the end of the corridor, watching him, her gaze unreadable. She approached slowly, her movements graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. "Captain," she said softly as she came to stand before him. "You seem troubled." "I'm fine," he replied, keeping his voice neutral, though he could feel his pulse quicken in her presence. "Just taking a moment to clear my head." Lyra stepped closer, too close. He could feel the warmth of her body, the faint scent of something floral and exotic. "You are a curious species, Captain. So much strength, so much restraint. I wonder which will win out in the end." Delaney swallowed hard, his mind racing for a response that would diffuse the situation without escalating whatever this was. Restraint is often necessary in diplomacy, Ambassador. It's what keeps things professional. Lyra's eyes gleamed with something dark and knowing. "Professional, yes, but sometimes, Captain, restraint is a prison, and sometimes it's better to let go." Her hand brushed lightly against his arm, sending a shock of electricity through him. "Perhaps you'll find that out sooner than you think." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Delaney standing in the corridor, his mind reeling from the encounter. As he returned to the negotiations, Delaney knew one thing for certain: this mission had just become far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. The stakes were higher than they appeared, and it wasn't just the fate of humanity that hung in the balance. There was something about Lyra, something dangerous and tempting, and he wasn't sure if he could resist it much longer. Captain Ethan Delaney's quarters aboard the Horizon were quiet, save for the soft hum of the starship's engines reverberating through the walls. The dim lights cast long shadows, giving the room a peaceful, almost contemplative atmosphere, which contrasted starkly with the storm brewing inside him. He sat at his desk, staring at the half-written mission report glowing on his data screen, but his mind was far from the tactical analysis he was supposed to be completing. Ever since the Rellan delegation had arrived, things had been tense. Not in the way most diplomatic meetings usually were, full of stiff pleasantries and careful, politically correct language, but something deeper, something personal. The Rellan ambassador, Lyra, had unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her intense gaze, her probing questions, and most of all, her suggestive comments always just on the edge of propriety had left him feeling like he was standing on a precipice, and the ground beneath him was slowly crumbling away. Delaney exhaled, running a hand through his short brown hair, trying to shake off the lingering tension. He wasn't used to feeling this way. Usually his composure was ironclad, unshakable, but Lyra had gotten under his skin. In the days since the initial meeting, her presence seemed to follow him everywhere. During their formal negotiations, her eyes always seemed to be searching for something beneath the surface, and every word she spoke seemed to carry an undertone of something unspoken, something deeper. There was a knock at the door, soft but distinct. Delaney straightened, pushing his thoughts aside. He tapped the control panel on his desk, and the door slid open with a quiet hiss. His breath caught for a moment as Lyra stood framed in the doorway, her golden skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the corridor. Her molten amber eyes met his, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow, shrinking to just the two of them. "Ambassador," Lyra, Delaney said, his voice a little tighter than he intended. "I wasn't expecting you." She stepped into the room, the door sliding shut behind her. "I sensed that, Captain," she replied, her voice low and smooth, carrying the same velvety quality that had unnerved him before. "But I thought it was time we spoke more openly." Delaney rose from his chair, unsure of what to make of her unexpected visit. Openly he asked, though he had a feeling he already knew what she meant. Yes, she said, moving closer. Our negotiations have been productive, but you and I both know there's something more happening here. Something neither of us has fully acknowledged. He felt the air in the room grow heavier, charged with an electricity that had been building ever since they first met. He swallowed, trying to keep his voice level. This is a diplomatic mission, Ambassador. Our focus should be on ensuring a successful alliance between our species. Lyra's lips curved into a slight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Diplomacy is important, yes, she agreed. But it's also a matter of understanding. And understanding goes beyond words, beyond politics. It delves into the essence of who we are. She paused, her eyes searching his. You felt it too, haven't you? This curiosity between us. Delaney felt the tension in his chest tighten. He had felt it, though he hadn't wanted to admit it to her, or even to himself. It was a pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw him toward her, despite every professional instinct telling him to keep his distance. I don't think this is a good idea, he said, his voice quieter now, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. Our roles are secondary, she interrupted, stepping even closer, until he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. Our positions are temporary, but this connection is something we should not ignore. Delaney's breath quickened. He could feel his resolve weakening with every passing second, the logical part of his brain waging a losing battle against the primal pull that Lyra seemed to exert effortlessly. She was right, there was a connection here. A spark that neither of them had expected, but it was undeniable, and it terrified him. Why me, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra's expression softened, her gaze intense, but no longer predatory. Because you're different, Captain. In my world, strength is measured by one's ability to dominate, to control. But you are strong because you resist. You fight against your own instincts, and that intrigues me. It makes me want to understand you more deeply. Delaney didn't know how to respond. Her words struck a chord deep inside him, a part of him that he had kept buried for so long. The weight of command, the responsibility of leading others, it had forced him to lock away parts of himself, to prioritize duty over desire, control over vulnerability. But Lyra was offering him something different, something he hadn't realized. He was craving the chance to let go, to explore a side of himself that had been dormant for far too long. Slowly, almost unconsciously, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, and he saw the flicker of emotion in her eyes, surprise, desire, and something else, something unspoken. This isn't right, Delaney whispered, even as he felt himself leaning into the pull. We shouldn't. Yeah. We should, Lyra said softly, her voice cutting through his resistance. You feel it, don't you? This connection between us. It's stronger than anything I've ever felt before. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment they were both suspended in that tension, neither of them willing to break the fragile balance between duty and desire. Then, in a sudden surge of emotion, Delaney closed the distance between them, pulling her closer in a movement that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Her hands slid up his arms, her touch firm and confident, yet filled with an unspoken yearning that mirrored his own. The kiss, when it came, was not gentle. It was a clash of energy, a release of all the tension that had been building between them from the moment they met. Delaney felt himself being consumed by it, every rational thought slipping away as the primal connection between them took over. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, while her fingers tangled in his hair, grounding him in the heat of the moment. Time seemed to lose meaning. There was no room for diplomacy, no space for negotiations or strategy. There was only the here and now, the raw intensity of their connection unfolding in ways neither of them could have predicted. Delaney felt his pulse quicken, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he lost himself in the moment. But as quickly as it had begun, the moment was shattered. A chime echoed through the room, a reminder that the world outside their small, private space was still moving, still waiting. Lyra pulled back slightly, her breath warm against his skin, her eyes searching his with a mixture of desire and hesitation. Delaney started, but his words trailed off. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? Lyra smiled softly, her fingers brushing against his cheek in a gesture that was surprisingly tender. We have time, she whispered. But for now, we should return to our duties. There will be more moments like this, if we choose to let them happen. Delaney nodded, his heart still racing. The logical part of his mind was screaming at him, reminding him of the consequences, the dangers of letting personal emotions get in the way of the mission. But the other part, the part that had felt the heat of her touch, the weight of her gaze, that part was louder. He watched as Lyra stepped back, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before she turned and made her way to the door. "Until next time, Captain," she said, her voice a soft promise. As the door closed behind her, Delaney exhaled, his body still humming with the residual energy of their encounter. He sat back down at his desk, his mind whirling with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. He had crossed a line he had sworn he wouldn't cross. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. There was something about Lyra, something that drew him in, made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. The connection between them had been undeniable. But what did it mean for their mission, for the fragile alliance between their people? He didn't know. All he knew was that things had just become infinitely more complicated, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. But deep down, a part of him was eager to find out. The dim glow of the observation deck stretched out before them, the stars glittering like diamonds scattered across the black velvet of space. Captain Ethan Delaney stood near the transparent wall, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, eyes fixed on the endless expanse beyond. He often found solace here, watching the distant stars, allowing the cold, unfeeling universe to ground him when the weight of command felt too heavy. But tonight, even the calming void couldn't ease the tension coursing through his veins. Behind him, Lyra's presence was like a flame warm, intense, and impossible to ignore. He could feel her eyes on him, the subtle brush of her energy permeating the space between them. It was a sensation that had grown familiar over the last few days since the Rellan ambassador had arrived on the horizon. From the moment they'd met, there had been something unspoken between them, a crackling undercurrent that seemed to defy the formalities of their respective roles. Ethan had tried to bury it. His job as captain required him to remain professional, objective, and focused on the mission. But Lyra had a way of breaking through his defenses, of making him feel like there was something more, something raw and real happening beneath the surface. And tonight he was struggling to keep that boundary intact. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Lyra's voice was soft, melodic, carrying that same velvety undertone that made his pulse race. She stepped up beside him, her golden skin catching the faint light from the stars outside. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was still talking about the stars. He glanced at her, catching the way her amber eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like molten fire. There was something magnetic about her, something that pulled him in even when every rational part of his mind told him to stay away. "I come here often when I need to clear my head," he said, his voice low. "It helps me put things in perspective." Lyra smiled faintly, her gaze shifting from the stars to him. "Perspective is important," she agreed. "But sometimes, it only brings more questions." Ethan raised an eyebrow, sensing the layers in her words. "What kind of questions?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much she wanted to reveal. "Questions about duty and desire. About the choices we make and the things we feel, even when we're not supposed to." There it was again, the subtle challenge, the unspoken tension between them laid bare in her words. Ethan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. This conversation was dangerous, and he knew it. But he couldn't seem to stop himself from continuing. "Desire can be a distraction," he said carefully, though even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching his. "Or it can be clarity. Maybe what we feel, what we want, shows us what really matters." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on the fragile line Ethan had been walking since the day they met. He turned to fully face her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Lyra, I've seen the way you look at me," she interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "And I know you felt it too, this connection between us." Ethan opened his mouth to deny it, to say something, anything that would put some distance between them, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. He had felt it. And no matter how much he tried to fight it, the pull between them was undeniable. "I'm your captain," he said instead, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't." "Stop thinking like a captain for a moment," she urged, taking a step closer. "Just be Ethan." The air between them crackled with tension, thick and heavy. Lyra was so close now, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin, could catch the faint, intoxicating scent that always seemed to linger around her. His breath hitched, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. This was wrong. He shouldn't want this. He couldn't, and yet, he did. Lyra reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through him. "You don't have to fight it, Ethan," she whispered, her voice soft and inviting. "Not tonight." His defenses crumbled. With a shaky exhale, he let himself lean into the moment, let himself forget the weight of command, the boundaries that had kept him on the straight and narrow for so long. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing gently across her skin. She leaned into his touch, her eyes half-lidded, and for a moment they just stood there, frozen in time, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. Then, as if drawn by some unseen force, he closed the distance. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like neither of them quite believed they were crossing that line. But the moment their lips met, the floodgates opened. The tension that had been building for days, weeks, finally found its release, and what began as a soft brush of lips quickly deepened into something more intense, more primal. Ethan's hand slid to the back of Lyra's neck, pulling her closer, as her arms wrapped around his waist. He felt her melt against him, her body fitting perfectly against his, as if they were two halves of the same whole. The taste of her, the feel of her was overwhelming, consuming. Every rational thought slipped away, leaving only the raw, undeniable need that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. Lyra responded with equal intensity, her hands sliding up his back, her fingers tangling in his hair as she kissed him like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. It was passionate, hungry, and yet there was something tender in the way they moved together, something that spoke of more than just physical desire. There was a connection here, a bond that went deeper than either of them had expected. They broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other's as they tried to catch their breath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened hanging between them like a fragile thread. Ethan started, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what to say." Lyra smiled softly, her eyes still closed, her lips just inches from his. "You don't have to say anything." He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes, searching for something reassurance, understanding, maybe both. "This changes things," he said, his voice quieter now, more uncertain. "Yes," she agreed, her tone gentle. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing." Ethan frowned slightly, his mind already racing ahead to the consequences. He was the captain of this ship. There were rules, expectations, responsibilities. This couldn't happen. It wasn't supposed to happen. But as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he realized something had already happened. And no amount of rationalizing or second-guessing was going to change that. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice soft and vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. "I don't know how to be both a captain and this." Lyra's hand came up to cup his cheek, her touch soft and reassuring. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," she said gently. "We'll take it one step at a time, together." He nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. But there was comfort in her words, in the way she looked at him not as a captain, but as a person, as Ethan. For a long time, they stood there in the quiet of the observation deck, their bodies pressed close, their breaths slow and steady. The stars outside continued to shine, indifferent to the turmoil unfolding inside the ship. But in that moment, Ethan didn't care about the stars, or the mission, or the weight of command. All he cared about was the woman in his arms, and the connection they had finally allowed themselves to acknowledge. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The atmosphere in Captain Ethan Delaney's quarters was charged with an intensity that neither he nor Lyra could deny any longer. The tension between them had built to a breaking point, simmering beneath the surface for days, maybe even weeks. It had been growing ever since that first moment when their eyes met, when unspoken desires had begun to cloud the line between duty and something far more dangerous. Ethan paced the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The walls seemed to close in on him, as if the very ship itself was aware of the storm brewing between them. His thoughts were a whirlwind, emotions tangled in a web of frustration, guilt, and an overwhelming urge that he could no longer suppress. Lyra stood in the center of the room, watching him with that same calm intensity that always managed to unsettle him. Her golden eyes, glowing faintly in the low light, followed his every movement, her expression unreadable. But there was something else beneath the surface, something burning just as fiercely as the conflict within him. "I can't keep doing this," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. He stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I can't keep pretending like nothing's changed." "Then stop pretending," Lyra said softly, her voice steady but filled with an undeniable heat. She took a step closer to him, her movements fluid, predatory like a flame drawn toward the kindling that would ignite it. Ethan turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rough with the weight of everything he'd been holding back. "I'm the captain of this ship. I have responsibilities, a crew that depends on me. I can't afford to get distracted." Lyra's gaze never wavered. "And you think this is just a distraction?" Her words hit him like a physical blow. No, it wasn't just a distraction. That much he knew. But admitting it, that was a step he wasn't sure he was ready to take. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. You know it's more than that, he finally said, his voice strained. But it doesn't matter. We can't. While Lyra interrupted, her voice rising in a rare show of emotion. She took another step closer, her eyes flashing with the fire that had been simmering beneath her calm exterior. Why can't we? Because of your title, your uniform. Is that really what's stopping you? Ethan didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense anyway. He wanted to tell her that it was his duty, his responsibility to his crew, but those excuses felt hollow in the face of the undeniable truth standing right in front of him. It's not that simple, he said weakly, knowing how pathetic the words sounded. Lyra's expression softened, but the heat in her eyes never faded. It is simple, Ethan. You're just afraid to admit it. He flinched at the truth of her words. She was right. Fear was at the heart of all this, fear of losing control, of crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Fear of what it would mean for them if they gave in to the desire that had been smoldering between them for so long. I'm not afraid, he lied, his voice low. Yes, you are, she said, stepping even closer, until there was barely any space left between them. You're afraid of what you feel. You're afraid of wanting something you think you can't have. Ethan's breath hitched as Lyra's hand came up to rest gently on his chest, her touch searing through the thin fabric of his shirt. He felt his resolve crumbling piece by piece under the weight of her presence. You don't have to fight it, Ethan, she whispered, her voice a blend of softness and heat. You don't have to carry all of this alone. His heart raced, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to pull away, to put distance between them before he did something he couldn't take back. But he couldn't move. Every fiber of his being was drawn to her, every thought clouded by the sheer intensity of what had been building between them for so long. You're going to regret this, he warned. Though his voice had lost its strength, Lyra's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Maybe. But I don't think you will. Before he could respond, she closed the final distance between them, her lips crashing against his in a kiss that was as much a confession as it was a release. Betrayal in the shadows. The dimly lit corridors of the starship hummed with an unsettling quiet, the usual buzz of crew activity muted by the late hour. Captain Ethan Delaney moved silently through the narrow passage, his mind heavy with thoughts that felt too dangerous to voice. The ship's mission had taken a treacherous turn, but it wasn't the intergalactic politics or the looming threat of war that gnawed at him. It was the creeping sense that someone aboard the ship had turned against him. Ethan had always trusted his crew implicitly, especially his first officer, Commander Rylan. They had fought battles side by side, survived impossible odds, and forged a bond built on years of loyalty and mutual respect. But now whispers of betrayal echoed in the recesses of his mind, planted there by the intelligence reports that had come to him through covert channels. Someone on his ship was feeding classified information to their enemies, and the trail of suspicion had led straight to Rylan. He didn't want to believe it. Couldn't. Rylan had been with him from the beginning, his unwavering support the one constant in an ever-changing galaxy. But the evidence was mounting, and Ethan knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. As he approached the ship's observation deck, where Rylan had asked to meet him in private, Ethan felt the weight of his sidearm pressing against his hip. He didn't want to use it, but the gnawing dread in his gut told him he might have to. The shadows cast by the stars outside the viewport stretched across the room like specters, wrapping the space in an eerie stillness. Rylan stood with his back to the door, gazing out at the endless sea of stars. He turned as Ethan entered, his usual calm expression unreadable in the half-light. You wanted to see me, Captain Rylan's voice was steady, but there was a coldness there that Ethan hadn't noticed before, or maybe hadn't wanted to. Ethan clenched his jaw, weighing his words carefully. We need to talk, Rylan. About some things I've learned, some things that don't add up. Rylan tilted his head slightly, his expression betraying nothing. What things? Ethan stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. You've been in contact with the enemy. There are transmissions coded, but we traced them. They were sent from this ship. From your station. Rylan's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, something dark and dangerous. You think I betrayed you? Ethan's fingers itched toward his sidearm. The air between them was thick with unspoken accusations, the bond they had shared for so long fraying at the edges. I don't want to believe it, Ethan said, his voice tight. But the evidence is there. You need to explain yourself, Rylan. Now. For a moment, silence stretched between them, the only sound the low hum of the ship's engines. Then, slowly, Rylan's lips curled into a smirk, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Captain Rylan said, his tone dripping with mock admiration. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that you figured it out. Ethan's heart sank. The words were a confession, but they felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Why Rylan? After everything we've been through, why betray us? Why betray me? Rylan's smile faded, replaced by a hard, bitter expression. Because loyalty is a fool's game. You've always been so focused on doing the right thing, Ethan. But out there, he gestured to the stars outside the viewport, there's no right or wrong. There's only power. And I'm not going to be on the losing side. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had suspected, but hearing Rylan speak the words was like a punch to the gut. You sold us out. You sold out our crew. For what? Money? Power. Both Rylan said simply, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The people you're fighting for, they don't care about us. They're using you, using all of us to push their agenda. I'm just getting ahead of the inevitable. Ethan shook his head, anger rising in his chest. You're wrong. There are still things worth fighting for, people worth protecting. You've turned your back on everything we believed in. Rylan's expression hardened. Maybe I have, but I've also ensured my survival, and that's more than I can say for you, Captain. In a swift movement, Rylan reached for the blaster holstered at his side, but Ethan was faster. The room exploded with the sound of a single shot, and Rylan staggered backward, clutching his side as blood seeped through his uniform. His eyes widened in shock, and for a moment he looked at Ethan with something that almost resembled regret. Ethan stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched his friend, his brother-in-arms, collapse to the floor. The reality of what had just happened hit him like a tidal wave, and he stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Rylan lay on the cold metal floor, his breathing shallow, his eyes losing focus. He tried to speak, but the words came out in a strained whisper. Ethan, you should have. Join me. Then, with a final rattling breath, he was gone. Ethan stood over Rylan's body, his mind reeling from the betrayal and the loss. The weight of what he had just done settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had survived another battle, but at what cost? In the silence that followed, the shadows seemed to press closer, as if the ship itself mourned the shattered trust that could never be repaired. The sun was just starting to rise, casting its golden light across the landscape as Captain Ethan Delaney stood on the observation deck of the newly christened starship, the Horizon. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change, rebuilding and reflecting on everything that had been lost. Now, as the ship prepared for its maiden voyage, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the beauty of the calm before the storm. The betrayal still lingered in the corners of his mind, like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. Rylan's face, those last words, haunted him in his quieter moments. But this was a new chapter, a chance to move forward and leave behind the pain and mistrust that had nearly broken him. He knew the crew needed a leader who was strong, who believed in the mission. And today, as he looked out at the endless horizon of space, he could finally see hope beyond the wreckage of the past. Captain. Captain. Ethan turned at the sound of the familiar voice. Lieutenant Zara Crest stood at the entrance of the observation deck, her expression soft but resolute. She had been his rock through it all, a constant source of support and understanding when the weight of command threatened to crush him. If anyone could help him find his way in this new beginning, it was her. I thought I'd find you here, she said, stepping closer, her gaze following his out to the glowing horizon. How are you feeling? Big day today. Ethan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm not sure if it's nerves or excitement, but I'm feeling something. He turned to face her fully, appreciating the steadiness in her presence. Everything's ready for launch, I assume? Zara nodded. The crew is assembled, the systems have been double-checked, and the engineers are giving us the green light. We're ready whenever you are. There was a pause, the two of them standing in comfortable silence, the weight of what lay ahead looming between them. Ethan felt the urge to confide in her, to share the doubts that still clung to him after everything that had happened. But there was no room for hesitation now. They had a mission, and the crew was looking to him for guidance. I keep thinking about how we got here, Ethan finally said, his voice low, as if he were confessing something he hadn't yet admitted even to himself. After everything that happened with Rylan, after the betrayal, part of me wonders if I'm even the right person to be leading this crew. Maybe someone else, someone without all the baggage, should be standing in this spot. Zara's eyes softened, and she took a step closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. No one else is more suited to this than you, Ethan. You may have doubts, but we believe in you. I believe in you. You've led us through the worst of it, and now you're the one who will lead us into whatever comes next. Her words brought a warmth to his chest, something that eased the tension he had been carrying since the day the betrayal was uncovered. He looked into her eyes, seeing not only belief but trust, something that had been so hard to come by in recent months. Zara had been with him through the darkest moments, and now here she was, standing by his side as he faced the future. When I was standing here looking out at all this, Ethan gestured to the horizon and the vastness of space beyond. I realized something. We've been through so much, seen the worst that people can do to each other, and yet, there's still so much beauty out there. I don't want to keep running from the past. I want to embrace what's ahead. I think we owe it to ourselves to look forward, not back. Zara's smile widened, a soft, knowing expression that told him she had known he would come to this conclusion on his own. Then that's exactly what we'll do, she said quietly. We'll make sure that whatever lies ahead is brighter than what we've left behind. Ethan nodded, the final remnants of doubt falling away. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the new responsibility settle into place. But this time it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to start fresh, not just for him, but for the entire crew. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. Let's get this ship moving, he said, his voice firm, filled with new resolve. They walked together to the bridge, the corridors alive with the quiet hum of anticipation. The crew was ready, and as Ethan stepped onto the bridge, all eyes turned to him. He could see the mix of excitement and nerves on their faces, the same feelings mirrored in his own heart. But as he took his place in the captain's chair, there was a calmness within him that hadn't been there before. Helm set coordinates for Sector 4-7. Engage when ready. The ship's engines purred to life, and as the horizon began to move, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was it, a new journey, a new adventure. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel weighed down by the past. As the stars stretched out before them, Zara glanced over at him, her eyes bright with a spark of something more than just professionalism. There was a connection there, one that had deepened through shared trials, and though neither of them spoke of it, the unspoken bond between them had become undeniable. Ethan returned her gaze, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. Here's to new beginnings, he said softly. Zara nodded, her smile mirroring his. To new beginnings. And as the horizon sped forward into the vast expanse of space, the past finally fell away, leaving only the infinite possibilities of the future.